Good evening. We're happy to host on tonight's Mujalasa Dr. TARIQ TELL, Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Studies and Public Administration of the American University of Beirut, where his teaching focuses on political development and social change, as well as on the historical political economy of the global South. We're very happy to have you tonight. Ahlan wa sahlan, and I'm very happy to be one of your students today, this year at the Kings.
Well, thank you very much to both Mujalasa and to Heritage and Roots for inviting me. I really enjoyed your work. And of course, it's very, very nice to be talking to one of my students.
It's a pleasure.
We've met over these topics, which we usually only discuss in class.
Mujalasa is a joint venture by AFIKRA and Heritage and Roots to bring scholars to discuss on digital space issues related to the Middle East and to the history of and the social and the political development of the Middle East. Dr. Tell has co-edited Village, Step and State, The Social Origins of Modern Jordan with Professor Eugene Rogan. He edited also The Resilience of Hashim Tool, Politics and the State in Jordan Before 1967, and in his book, The Social Origins of Middle Eastern Monarchy, The Moral Economy of Hashim Tool in Jordan, was published in 2013. His research interests also include the political economy of Arab monarchies, the history and politics of the military in Jordan, historical political ecology of the Bedouin, the Fertile Crescent, and the historical relationship between food sovereignty, empire, and moral economy in the modern Middle East. Given this area of specialization, our three basic first questions are very simple. What is the modern Middle East? Where is the modern Middle East? And when and how did the notion of a Near or Middle East emerge?
They're actually very complicated questions. And what seems very obvious, once you dig into it, becomes very complicated and also very much contested. Part of the problem is that they tend to be equated with ideologies. Islamic ideology, most obviously and most recently, but at one time, of course, the idea of an Arab world and Pan-Arabism. The best way, I think, of approaching the Middle East is twofold. First, to look at its geopolitics and its state system as a result of the intrusion of the West, by which I mean Europe and its overseas offshoots, into Western Asia, part of this broad expansion of Europe after the 16th century, and to make the argument that the state system has its origins in attempts by the Europeans to either police or to divide or to exploit the area to the south and to the east of the Mediterranean. And part of their aim, of course, was to provide protection for imperial lines of communication, which is particularly true of the British, who had the largest role in the creation of the state system as we know it in the Middle East, who were very worried about the routes to India. So the political structures which we see in the Middle East today are in part a result of this European geopolitical intrusion on the region, but we shouldn't forget that also local and indigenous resistance played a very important role, not least in the form of the revolution from above carried out by Mustafa Kemal in the heartland of the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia, which produced modern Turkey. And also we have other movements which are also important and should be mentioned. Reza Shah's state building project in Iran, but also Wahhabism. And we've had three waves of Wahhabi state building from the late 18th century, which interacted in complicated ways with external imperialism, but played certainly a role in defining the frontiers of the states which emerged from the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire in 1918, particularly the southern desert side of this, which is what I focus upon.
Western intrusion that divided. What would have been the factors of unity in the Middle East, other than political unity, especially under the Ottoman Empire?
I think that the factors of unity are often treated in political rather than real historical terms. So we tend to argue that because there is a single Arab language from, say, Morocco till the Persian Gulf, then this should push us towards unity. But there are other places which are unified by language and yet are divided by colonialism and by states, and most obviously Latin America would be the case there. To think about the factors for unity, we actually have to think, I think, in counterfactual terms. What if the Ottoman Empire had survived longer? And what if, say, the state-building project of Muhammad Ali in Egypt had been more successful, or if Nasser had been able to emulate him 100 years later? So there are geopolitical factors dealing with fragmentation. And I think unity is largely driven by state projects, yes, and by projects of imperial expansion. Now, it is the case, however, that for much of the period after the dismemberment of the Roman Empire and the rise of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries, this part of the world was dominated by large empires. Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Mamluks to an extent, but then the Ottomans as kind of successors, basically, to the Roman project. Yeah, and this is connected, I think, to the nature of the trade routes which crossed the region, which provided the sources for large states to emerge. It might also be connected with two-step effects, which we'll talk about later. The most interesting one is the step effect coming from the Central Asian steppes, large numbers of nomadic conquerors who began to arrive, particularly after the 10th century, and became key elements.
Became the ruling elites.
They became the ruling elites and key elements in the process of state building in certainly the eastern part of our region. And I'm going to talk about its complications in a minute. And the Ottomans, of course, perhaps were the most successful among them.
How can we explain the dynamics between the steppes and, let's say, the area of the Middle East now, and how did that result in state formation?
Well, in the Middle East, there's actually a further complication, which instead of this vast expanse of grassland, there is also in the Middle East a patchwork of caravan cities, areas of intensive agriculture, and then mountain and steppe. So the areas of the mountain and steppe, these form what the 14th century Tunisian philosopher, historian Ibn Khaldun called Imran Badawi. And they provided political cohesion and also military advantages, particularly between, say, the 5th century and the 15th century, when gunpowder took over. Mobile pastoralists, particularly those able to use this short composite bow of horn and wood, were really a very effective fighting force and often able to outmaneuver the armies of settled states and to defeat them as under the Mongols or under the Seljuks.
See how these elements are usually disregarded in larger histories from above the Middle East, and where we tend to explain history in other terms. But these little technological advances, let's say, determined the victory of an army over another. And basically, we can argue that these steppe people control the political life of the Middle East.
I think that there was a more complicated picture going on. It wasn't simply military power or a despotic patrimonial steppe tradition, which a lot of people who read Weber and who read theories of Oriental despotism make the argument was the case. Some of the steppe people, first of all, most of the people of the steppe, whether the Arabian steppes, the North African ones, or even the Central Asian, interacted with centers of civilization across the millennia. They were always a source of horses, trade, and soldiers. Yeah. Secondly, I think the important factor which brought them into the politics of the Middle East was complicated ecological changes we don't quite understand yet, but historians are beginning to look at, which led to a nomadic infiltration and an expansion of nomadic areas, but also factionalism and disagreements among the conquering elites which emerged from the Islamic State, which led them to look for a safe and politically neutral force which could support their power. The idea of slaves on horses, which Patricia Crone spoke about. several decades ago. So this factionalism was also an element in the entry of these nomads into political life within the region. And then, of course, there were these huge processes of nomadic conquest unleashed from the time of Genghis Khan. And here there's a more complicated story going on. It's partly to do with the rise, it's to do with the rise of nomadic empires in the steppe. This has to do with receiving tribute from China, which provides the resources to create a conquering coalition. And then the fact that the steppe was also an important conduit of trade, and particularly of the Silk Route, which drew the conquerors along there, and then they tried to manipulate the trade routes to their advantage, destroying some cities, reestablishing others. And of course, Genghis Khan began a process of steppe state building, I think, which was slightly different from that, say, of Attila the Hun a millennium or half a millennium before, in that he actually decided to build a state in the steppe but use the resources of the zone to supply it. Yeah? And this meant creating systems of land and taxation which could allow them to build and maintain the army. Now, Linda Darling, who's a historian of Ottoman taxation by origins, has written a very interesting book, in my view, which brings this idea of moral economy into the story. She makes the argument that if you look at the different sorts of dynasties which emerge from this kind of steppe milieu, some were much more long-lasting than others.
In terms of
how long they ruled for and how long they controlled different areas. Many of them were very fragile and broke apart very quickly, but those which endure, in her view, were those which she says first had high degrees of cohesion or asabiyya when they conquered.
So we're using notions from
Ibn Khaldun, but she also takes another notion from Ibn Khaldun, less often used, which is not a military explanation, but more a political economy explanation. Okay. This other notion is this idea of the circle of justice. She argues that some of the more cohesive dynasties had the cohesion and therefore the autonomy to use a pattern of statecraft which had emerged in the Middle East in ancient times, goes back to the Sasanian and Babylonian empires, and this idea of the circle of justice.
Many of our listeners never heard of circle of justice.
Indeed, and I think many historians and Orientalists have not used it either.
Why was it a circle, and why is it a circle of justice?
Okay, so the argument was that basically at the foundation of any state is a secure source of revenue. Okay. But you can only deliver this by treating the people who produce the surplus in a just way. So you have to look after the peasantry in particular, who form the vast majority of these people, of the populations of these states, and not tax them too heavily. If you tax them too heavily, then they will rebel or escape or defect, or they will not cultivate properly, so you won't have the surplus. Now, what the surplus does is it provides the revenue to maintain the loyalty of the military. The loyalty of the military, in turn, gives power to the ruler, who then delivers justice to the rest of the population. So you have a circle closing with the movement of a moral economy from the process of taxation into the process of paying the various followers of the regime, to finally keeping in power the king or the mulk, which is based on justice, and it's based also on the idea of Sharia. Yes, so it's a religiously endorsed, and it's elaborated in religious terms, but it has a definite political economy under it.
And this is a key factor in understanding state formation and the relation between the state and the rule in the Middle East.
I would argue it's a key factor in understanding state consolidation, and then the cohesion and the resilience of these states. And it leads us on to the idea of a moral economy in the state.
In the context of these factors that are not usually part of mainstream historiography and history in the Middle East, you speak of a trilogy between the Bedouins, the Fellahin, the peasants, and the city. Would you please elaborate on this idea, and how is it key in understanding political and social and economic dynamics in the Middle East?
Of course. But I mean, what we want to do now, of course, is also shift our discussion and our definition of the Middle East from the geopolitical definition which we provided before to one which explains why this trilogy exists.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think the best approach to that is to talk about an arid zone, stretching, say, between Morocco and the Hindu Kush, where you have mountain and steppe, but also areas of intensive agriculture, but also a high degree of uncertainty over a very long period in the amount of rainfall which descends. And so the idea of the Middle East as an arid zone, I think, is fundamental for understanding this trilogy. Now, let's start with the kind of the best known of it, which is the city. The cities were, as I say, in my view, mostly caravan cities, usually supported by a small hinterland of intense cultivation. This gets larger, of course, in places like Mesopotamia and in the Nile Valley, which have their own specific dynamics. But even they are surrounded by deserts and steppe, which peasants can survive, can escape. The Fellahin are very important in this, and the Fellahin vary between those which are members of Ashair and have their own cohesion and have their own asabiyya. And Ibn Khaldun was very clear about this. He didn't actually just maintain it was only the nomads which had cohesion and asabiyya. Sanhaya Berbers, who built the Muwahideen state, say, in North Africa, would be a strong counterexample to that. And they were often interacted on the one side with the tax collectors from the city. They were also under the thumb of merchants in the city when they were too close. They would cultivate a spectrum of different crops, but also indulge in a spectrum of practices, which often included agropastoralism. And that, of course, tied them in with the nomads who occupied the steppe. Now, the logic of being a nomad, I think, is best explained in ecological terms. These are areas with very little rainfall, so very low precipitation, and very little water. So the only way that you can create a balance, an ecological balance which sustains life, is to harvest water over a vast area. And the way to do that is to drive livestock across this vast area, which can capture the moisture in different sorts of crops. And this, the kind of livestock you'd use would be sheep, goats, horses, and then, of course, the dromedary, which allows you to go right deep into the desert and harvest it over an even bigger sort of area. Now, what also happened was that in the early part of the first millennium, the dromedary as a beast of transport was developed, I think, in very interesting ways with the emergence of the so-called North Arabian camel saddle, which allowed it to be ridden much more easily and much more quickly over long distances. It didn't allow the transformation of the dromedary into a fighting animal, as some people like Dostal maintain, because it bounces up too much then to allow that. But it turned into the most effective means of transport in the pre-modern world, and an important source, of course, of energy, of animal energy, in place of the water energy and the water mills you find in places like Europe. And this, of course, had a dramatic effect on the trade routes which crisscrossed the Middle East, and also the organization of the cities, which become these quarter-based cities with narrow streets rather than the broad avenues of the Roman period. And this was a result of the superiority, really, of camel transport over wheeled sort of transport. What this also means is the nomads become a key element in the life of the cities, in the movement of trade, in the movement of transport, and also in such things as the pilgrimage to Mecca, which becomes, of course, foundational under Islam, and becomes and is only possible through the camels of the nomads.
Managed by different.
It's managed by states, and it's managed by states in alliance and in connection with tribes. So this, of course, reverses the usual picture we have of this trinity of a stereotype of states facing barbaric nomads who expand and cause desertification. Actually, it was more of a symbiotic sort of relationship, and the nomads and the peasants are drawn into the factional life of the cities.
Can we trace back this stereotype about the Bedouins being barbarians, being disruptive of civilizations to Orientalism, or even to a pre-Orientalist period in the literature?
I think it's always been there in settled civilizations. But the important one in terms of our current understanding of the role of the nomads, I think, is the Orientalist one, which was particularly prominent in French North Africa, where the presence of conquering Bedouin, who the Beni Hilal, the so-called Beni Hilal, who supposedly led to the decline of agriculture and the desertification of North Africa was used as justification for colonialism.
And this narrative was also used by Zionism to justify colonization over Palestine.
Absolutely, and also, which is of greater interest to me, the so-called Transjordan option,
yes,
which emerged in the early 30s of buying land on the East Bank after resistance to Jewish land purchases in Palestine rose. And it's justified the same way, that ever since the rise of Islam and the Arab conquests, there's been a retreat of cultivation and agriculture in the Middle East, and it's a result of nomadic hostility to agriculture. And it is really not borne out by any of the historical or archaeological evidence. If you are a nomad or a peasant or any other actor in such an arid environment, you try to invest in a multi-resource economy. So nomads almost always had subsections of their tribes which farmed, or they had close relationships with farmers, and they were not likely to try to destroy this relationship because it would reduce their ability to survive droughts or
desertification. Different vision of the role of the nomads in the history of the Middle East and in usually global history. Speaking of a more recent history, some historians are now rewriting the modern history of the Middle East, especially the period of the state formation following the fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. However, this Ottoman factor is either completely out of the picture or depicted as the quintessential enemy of Arab nationalism. How can we tackle this issue in a more balanced way?
I think by simply accumulating much more archival work, which actually Ottoman historians are doing. Ottoman history is one of the real growth areas, I think, in global history, and it's being rethought in very interesting ways. Our problem for many decades in the in the former Ottoman territories was a mutual hostility between both the Turks and the Arabs, both of whom tended to come up with narratives which blamed the other for their misfortunes in the modern period. So the Turks maintained that they were stabbed in the back in World War I, and the Arabs had held them back because they were backward and savage. And here they borrowed a lot of European Orientalist terminology. The Arabs maintained that it was the Ottoman occupation which led to a long-term decline of Arab civilization from its glorious heights and the opposites. And this narrative actually replicates the narrative of the Orientalists. And the idea of Ottoman decline, I think, is being deconstructed very carefully. It's just a matter of a different development and a development at a different pace than that of Europe. Although probably we can have environmental accounts which explain why this different pace occurred. Now, the other side of this, of course, is the argument about Arab nationalism and about the Arab revolt, which is, of course, caught up with the whole Hajj route and the Hijaz and the pretensions of the Hashemites to the leadership of this revolt. And I think it's first important to remember that the Sharif of Mecca launched his revolt not as an Arab revolt, although it had an Arab element, but he was also arguing that I'm going to restore the legitimacy of the Ottoman state. And I think the historical consensus now is that rather than an Arab awakening, which produced an Arab nationalism that was inevitably going to come into conflict with the Ottoman state, it was developments within the Ottoman state itself which hurried this process up, particularly the rise of the Young Turks, who had their own exclusive nationalism. But also most of the Arabists actually were seeking a confederal form of empire rather than complete independence until well into World War I. And it was really the costs of World War I, the pressure of building and maintaining a war machine in the face of the invading British armies, the British blockade, which had a key role in sparking scarcity and famine in many of the cities of the Levant, especially in Mount Lebanon, but also scarcity in the Hijaz. It was, and then of course the pressure of so-called Safar Barlik and conscription and the general drawing out of resources for warfare, and finally the sheer costs of the war. Remember that Anatolia and Greater Syria, I think, had the largest civilian casualties anywhere in the Great War. All of this caused a final shift towards Arabism and the break with the Young Turks, but it came extremely late. And even then, if you look at the actual history of the war, it's possible to imagine different scenarios with the resources at hand. If, for instance, the Ottomans had withdrawn their forces from the Hijaz and redeployed them in northern Palestine, it's unlikely they'd have been outmaneuvered at Megiddo. Then, with the Ludendorff offensives on the Western Front, it's quite possible that the British would have had to draw down their forces. They did draw down their forces in the Middle East, and you'd have had a different sort of outcome with much of what is now Jordan, Syria, and northern Iraq still in Ottoman hands, which of course would lead to a different dynamic of development within Turkey. So the idea of an inevitable clash, or the idea of the Ottomans as somehow being the cause of our backwardness, I think needs a lot of rethinking.
In Guns, Gold, and Grain, you speak about war and food supply in the making of Transjordan. Can you shed some light, please, on this?
Not quite the making of Transjordan, but I think the progress of the Arab Revolt, because the Arab Revolt ends in Damascus. Now, we don't know enough, I think, about the ideologies and the ideas of the grassroots participants in the Arab Revolt, which are the Bedouin and the Fallahin in what was southeastern Syria and the Hijaz at that time. We now have a very important study funded by the Hashemites on the 100th year of the revolt, the Arab Revolt Project, which has actually recovered the resources. It's carried out field archaeology in southern Jordan and shown that there was really a massive investment by the Ottoman state in protecting the lines of communication into the Hijaz and really intensifying the fortifications there. And this was really not a sideshow. It was more a well thought out guerrilla strategy. British sources still give credit to Lawrence, but we don't know what the decision-making process was in this revolt, and it's quite likely that it would have been Faisal or one of his advisors who thought of this, where they basically left the Ottomans in place along a very long line of communications and forced them to divert more and more resources into maintaining these lines of communications. Now, they did this by building a tribal ladder up the western coast of Arabia and into southern Jordan, getting as far as Al-Karak or Ma'an. Now, this is where I think the guns and the gold come in, that the way they co-opted many of these tribal figures, whatever their ideological relationship to the Hashemites or to the Arab Revolt, was by providing them with guns, grain, and gold. And the grain and the gun in particular was at a premium because of the scarcity brought out by the by the British blockade. So it was the threat of famine which these groups faced, which made the lure which the Hashemite was providing, which of course the Ottomans were trying to provide counter incentives for them, so very important. And if you look at the pattern of the Arab Revolt, it succeeded it wasn't able to penetrate into Al-Karak or Al-Balqa or into Ajlun and Hawran. It succeeded in other way, in other words, in areas which had a grain deficit, where grain was really at a premium. If you had enough grain, it actually paid you to sit on the fence to see what would happen with these armies as they fought their way backwards and forwards across your territory rather than commit. And I think that's a much better explanation of the kind of patchwork nature of support for Faisal's forces as they marched north.
How can we feed this process into the process of the emergence of Transjordan as a state?
Transjordan is further down the road. And I think Jordanians get quite annoyed if you tell them that it was an afterthought, it was an artificial state. And then they shouldn't, because they simply need to carry out a thought experiment, which is, what if Faisal's state in Syria had endured?
Yes.
Would we have had a separate state in what was then southeastern Syria, the districts of Ajlun, Balqa, Al-Karak, and Ma'an within there? I think it's very unlikely. But that does not mean that there was not a Jordanian society, or this was just some group of Bedouin. No, it was actually a very a thriving agricultural frontier with a large town in Salt, and Ottoman state building from the 1850s onwards had laid down what I think Eugene Rogan calls very neatly seams of stateness, a basis for state building later on. And of course, the process of Ottoman education had drawn this population and the local elites into the Ottoman schooling system, and therefore involved them in the politics of Ottomanism and Arabism, which I've been talking about.
And also the Hijaz Railway.
The Hijaz Railway did this even, carried that integration even more closely. But notice that the Hijaz Railway replaced the Hajj routes. And we now are about to have a really, I think, path-breaking book from Nora Barakat, a historian at Stanford, who's actually looked at the Ottoman archives for the 18th century and the early 19th century. And she shows very, very clearly that the Bedouin elites interacted very closely with the Ottoman Hajj authorities, and they didn't just interact with this payment of protection money. They were also given things like commodities like coffee, which they, in lieu of the payments, which they then traded in places like Mzirib, but also with the Hajj caravan itself. And you have to look at the Hajj caravan, 25,000 to 30,000 strong. It's basically a mobile town of exceptionally rich people, because only the rich could carry out the Hajj. And they brought with them goods, money, and gold in order to defray the cost of this.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, this was the economic basis of it, but alongside it, of course, is a political process where the money and the goods paid out by the Ottomans could be used by sheikhs to build up their own followings. Yeah. So this, of course, drew, she shows, in the course of the 17th and 18th century, a tribe like the Bani Sakhar up from Al-Ula in the Hijaz, so they established themselves in southeastern Syria. And as the Hajj caravan began to decline with the opening of the Suez Canal, shifted into agriculture and turned themselves into large landowners in Al-Balqa. So they were very much players in this process, rather than some sort of alien group coming from a frontier. The famous article by Selim Deringel, they live in a state of nomadism. So, they didn't. They may have been nomads, but they lived in a close contact with the state. And this was even more true of larger tribes, like larger tribal confederations, like the Nizar, like the Shammar, and particularly the Nizar, of course, played a key role in the whole machinations of the Hajj.
Also, you mentioned in class, and remember that sometimes people would go into a state of nomadhood to escape the tentacles of the state. And
I think this is very, very likely. And it's almost always connected to environmental shifts, where it becomes harder to produce an agricultural surplus. But what happens is that you can farm from a tent, particularly for an agro-pastoralist, and therefore avoid the state much more easily. So there's a famous piece of research by a Palestinian and German geographer who looked at they compared the Ottoman tax registers in the 16th century with the accounts of European travelers in the early 19th. And they purport to show a vast abandonment of villages in this period. And this is part of this narrative of desertification and the spread of nomadism. But actually, archaeological work has shown that farming went on even after the villages are abandoned, and tended to avoid the Ottoman tax collectors and those who registered this land, and also even avoided maybe local notables. So local networks become ways of maintaining your security and avoiding the Ottoman state. And some of these local networks would involve an alliance with nomadic groups, and it's necessary mobility to avoid the pressure of external groups trying to grab taxes from them.
In a more recent history, did the emergence into statehood of the Middle East condemn it to a cycle of violence?
I don't think it's just the statehood. I think it's the pattern of the states. What emerged, I think, in the Middle East are, we always talk about highly artificial states.
Yes.
But in fact, what emerged was a series of states which were forged from the kind of tribal periphery of the late Ottoman Empire, alongside large local established powers, the Turkish state in Anatolia, which turned away, but Iran and Egypt, both of which had pretensions to great power hegemony, and a Wahhabi state in Arabia, which had always been expansionist, even though it didn't have the means to do so, but acquired huge oil wealth in the 1930s and the 1940s. So it's this imbalanced geopolitical structure, I think, which leads to the kind of fraught geopolitics. And a lot of the violence came from the establishment of Israel.
Yes.
Israel was established for reasons of imperial strategy, not sentiment by the British. They wanted a way of getting the French out of Palestine, which under Sykes-Picot had been an international entity. And they used Zionism to give themselves the mandate. And they looked on Palestine as being a loyal little, a Zionist Palestine as a loyal little Ulster protecting the banks of the Suez Canal. Now, the actual Jewish project was able to morph with the rise of the United States into a movement for Israeli independence, which went against the wishes of the British probably in the 1940s. But then it offered the US a potential Cold War asset in its struggle with the Soviet Union, which the US steadily brought to the center of its Middle Eastern strategy as oil becomes more important. And I think a lot of the violence which the Israelis visit upon the area is a result, first, of the ethnic cleansing on which they were founded and why they accumulated the resources of their state, but also an attempt by disrupting the Arab order to reforge this order around their own interests and allow them to build a connection with the areas of real American interest in the Gulf. And they were able to turn themselves into a Cold War asset of the Americans because, of course, of the Black September internal war in Jordan, where a story about how the Syrian invasion was averted was used to make the Israelis, or the threat of Israeli intervention, appear as an asset in the Cold War. And this then consolidated Israel's role as a proxy of the Americans and led to its arming and turning into a local superpower. It already, of course, acquired nuclear weapons by a mixture of support from America and from the Kennedy administration. So it's very much, I think, Israeli strategy, which plays a big role in the violence of the region's geopolitics, but it's also the instability of the states which were created in places like Iraq and in Syria. In Iraq in particular, if you think about it, the British reconfigured the province of Baghdad and Basra by bringing into it a Kurdish, partly Kurdish north, and by relying heavily upon the Sunni as their key collaborators, they also delegitimized the power structure in Baghdad and brought the threat of Shiism. So this, with the Iranian Revolution, creates a pressure on the state to try to find a way to break out. Actually goes back before the Iranian Revolution, I think, to Faisal's early years as well. He thought one of the ways of protecting Hashemite rule in Iraq would be unity with Syria, because he'd been king there before, and there was a threat from Turkey to Mosul. So the internal structure of Iraq also predisposes it to push towards reconfiguring the state structure in this area. And if you bring these factors together, and the fact that we don't have a powerful enough a state which can become a regional hegemon, you see how the instability emerges.
One of the mainstream ideas about the situation in the Middle East is that of a failed modernization to explain the present day political, social, and economic. How accurate is that vision, and what are the shortcomings of this perspective of a failed modernization? Modernization according to what criteria?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of modernization theory. I think modernization theory and even the idea of modernism grows out of the idea that we have to emulate either the West or the Enlightenment in order to chart a path towards an industrial and prosperous future. And I think a better approach would be to look at capitalism, and particularly the connections between capitalism and fossil fuel, which have been crucial for the growth and expansion of capitalism. And it so happens that the Middle East is very unfortunate in having the largest deposit of oil anywhere. So at a certain point in the evolution of this fossil capitalism, the Middle East was always bound to become of great interest to external powers. Now, where I think the modernization failed was if you bring this fact that most of the wealth of the Middle East is as a result of fossil capital, and that the state structure which emerged from the destruction of the Ottoman Empire separated the areas of dense population, globalization, and long-established institutions from the much more sparsely populated Arabian hinterlands, and particularly from very small entities and polities in the Gulf, which were turned into places like the UAE or Kuwait. So the wealth is in one place, and the people and the skills and the human capital is in another. And I think this is the best explanation for the fact that the Middle East grew very, very slowly. Now, what also was important here is that one of the key areas which benefited from the process of colonial economic development, which was Palestine, was lopped off. If you look at the last successful economic unification of the region, it occurred under the Middle East Supply Center during World War II, when based in Cairo, but administering an area stretching from Libya to Ethiopia, across the Arabian Peninsula to Iran. And the aim was to develop local production, local industry, so as to save on shipping space. And therefore also a system of rationing was put in place, which benefited favored merchants. Now, one of the areas which benefited most from this was Palestine, where particularly the Jewish economy industrialized very, very rapidly. Lebanon benefited slightly to it, but not to the same extent.
Yes.
And of course, what then occurs is that this part of the Middle Eastern economy, the most productive, is completely cut off from it because of the Nakba and of the conflict which followed. So, and this of course also disrupts things like the communications through Haifa, the oil routes, they now move towards Lebanon. You get complete shifts as a result of this. And of course, the whole impact of the Nakba on the radicalization of Arab nationalism has to be fed into the story, because part of this process was nationalization and therefore migration and the flight of capital, and also very important human capital. And here, I think the religious element does play an important role, which in ways that people haven't studied so far. If you look at the process of educational expansion in the Middle East, there was an important Ottoman component, an important component by figures like Muhammad Ali, but there was also massive investment by external missionary schools.
Yes.
And sadly, because of the shifting balance between different communities and the loss, really to a large degree, of the very plural religious structure of the Middle East, there's been a huge drain of human capital out of the region. So this must have a huge role on development, and particularly in the long run.
Dr. Tell, thank you for your time, and thank you for this extremely wealthy episode in Insights of the Middle East.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Stay tuned for our next Mujalasa, and meanwhile, like and subscribe and share. Thank you.